Hey everybody, you're listening to episode 9 of From Guns to Keyboards. Today we're discussing Iran, Israel, the United States. What does everybody want? But first, quick news update about what's been happening in the region since we all last spoke. So, obviously the biggest news story is the Iranian attack against Israel. Sure enough, the attack came in the form of 170 drones, 130 cruise missiles, and 30 ballistic missiles. Thankfully, the damage was negligible. We had several missiles hitting the Nevatim air base, destroying or damaging one helicopter and several buildings, but nobody was killed. Israel responded just a couple nights ago in attacking the Isfahan air base in Iran, again with very negligible results. The Iranians themselves appear to be playing this down. Moving a little bit closer back to the country, we see that last week also saw the tragic death of a 14-year-old settler shepherd whose death then resulted in reprisal attacks from Israeli settlers against nearby Palestinians. So once again, we see the West Bank very much on the verge of a major outbreak of violence. In the north, there were 2 Hezbollah high-ranking commanders who were killed in an Israeli airstrike, and as a response, Hezbollah launched a massive rocket barrage at a border town in the north, injuring some severely 14 Israeli soldiers. Down in Gaza, we saw photos in the Deir al-Balah beach of beachgoers on Wednesday, which was an incredibly hot day here in the Middle East, which is perhaps for us a microcosm of the end of military operations in Gaza. While there's still talk of an invasion of Rafah, the process of this invasion, of beginning this invasion appears to be moving at a snail's pace. Meanwhile, there were a response from Hamas in regards to the hostage deal. Hamas rejected Israel's proposal and instead presented their own with even tougher conditions for the release of the hostages, the main one being the end to the war in Gaza, which the Israeli government has rejected. Bibi Netanyahu immediately seized this opportunity to try and prove to the Israeli public that it is not the fault of the government that they have been unable to secure the release of the hostages, which has done very little, it appears, in assuaging the families of those who are still being held captive by Hamas. What will come of this remains to be seen, but as everybody gets ready to sit down for Passover, the thoughts or the empty chairs will certainly be on the minds of the families, and the thoughts of the hostages will be, I believe, probably on the mind of every Israeli, and perhaps even Jews worldwide, as they begin to commemorate the Jewish emancipation from slavery in Egypt. So, with that being said, Michael, let's get back to the main question we want to talk about. First, maybe we want to give a little bit of background on the attack. It was the night of April 13th to April 14th. What was that like for you? Were you awake? You were checking the phone? What were you up to?
I was at home. Like all of us, we were waiting for this attack to come. And then, like a really bad Hollywood movie, we see Iran make the decision of, in a highly choreographed fashion, launching 300 different pieces of ammunition at the state of Israel, including ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, carrying ammunition with them. And we all just kind of looked at this like, all right, I guess it's countdown until the missiles make their way into Israeli airspace.
There was a feeling, a little bit of Armageddon going on in Israel, I think. There was a very big concern of where exactly are they launching towards? Should I get ready to run? I think the Home Front Command that night at 8 p.m. actually canceled schools for all children. My son's daycare obviously canceled. And it was suddenly like, there was a oh shit moment, I would say, in Israel. Like, this is really happening.
There was definitely an oh shit moment like that in Israel. And I think it was somewhat of a small example of what Israel is in this greater neighborhood, and how Israel finds itself in quite a few situations with its neighbors. And I even remember on the night of the attack, my fiance asked me to run downstairs and pick up a couple of things from the convenience store because she said to me that with everything going on, that she didn't really feel comfortable going outside and saying hello to 300 different missiles that are about to land on her. And I go outside assuming that the streets are going to be empty, and I see Tel Aviv out and about. All the bars are packed, everybody's drinking, everybody's having a good time. And I think that this event that happened was definitely like a weird Armageddon-styled feeling of we're all gonna die. But at the same time, it happens alongside this deep cultural notion of resilience that is very integral to the way Israel responds to its enemies, and could very well be seen on the night of the attack.
Yeah, I was definitely one of those people too. My birthday was that night. My wife and I still went out to dinner.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
The Iranians planned for you
the Iranians,
firecrackers.
A little fireworks show, yeah, bringing 32 years. So appreciate it. At least they didn't do it, the night before, so I might have been held sitting in my home all day, COVID style. But yeah, I was very much out and about. And you're right, there is this feeling of Israeli resilience. At the same time, the next day at work, when I was talking to one of my colleagues, nobody slept. Everybody was glued to their phones. Everybody was, quite frankly, very, very afraid of what might happen. And I mean, this attack is so interesting to me because this, on the one hand, the Iranians very much, as you said, they very much choreographed it. They announced it prior to the attack just beginning, and they announced the end of the attack as well. It wasn't like they could have done, they have enough ammunition to have done this in multiple waves if they wanted. They didn't have to announce to the world that, hey, we're done, don't worry about it, this is all it's going to be in the air. But they did. At the same time, this was a major, major attack. And it cannot be understated that for the Iranians in particular, I mean, back in 2021, I believe, when the Americans assassinated Soleimani, here we have probably the greatest military mind that came from the Islamic Republic of Iran in their entire 40-year history, that has just been killed by who the Iranians say are their greatest adversary, both geopolitically and morally. And in response, they launched 16 cruise missiles at 2 U.S. military bases. Compare that now to over 300 that were launched to Israel. So my question is this. On the one hand, it was very choreographed. On the other hand, it was a massive arsenal. What do the Iranians intend to happen with all this?
I think from the Iranian perspective, they learned that Israel, despite all of its grand statements of deterrence and power and we'll strike back eye for an eye, anybody who comes after us, the Iranians learned that the Israelis are much less sensitive to pain than they let off. And just like the Israelis have basically allowed Hezbollah to set up something of a security zone in Israeli territory north of Israel that's very much controlled by Hezbollah in a de facto way, where Israelis have been evacuated from their homes. Hezbollah launches rockets and missiles at the Israeli home front. Just like Hezbollah has managed to put Israel in this situation, and Israel by and large responds with tit-for-tat attacks on Hezbollah, the Iranians very much understood that that's probably the most it's going to get with them too. They'll hit Israel, and the worst thing that'll happen is that the Israelis will strike back and kind of even out the playing field. And that understanding that it's all tit for tat with the Israelis and it's possible to continue playing this game made them realize that on the one hand, they stand a lot to gain with their own domestic public by presenting themselves as this major international player that can take on the Zionist regime, quote unquote, while on the other hand, paying a very low price.
I think, so it's interesting you say, first of all, man, I love you because you always got that rah around the flag, which I deeply appreciate it. The second thought, what I do want to say though, is from the Iranian perspective, and they made this very clear, was that this was their tat for our tit. We assassinated one of their IRCJ generals up near Damascus, which was next to their consulate, which they consider to be their sovereign territory. An argument which, by the way, I fully accept. I do think that attacking another nation's embassy or consulate is very much attacking their sovereign territory. I think that's... but, so as a result, I think that this was the Iranians feeling like they were leveling the playing field. And that for them, this was a... maybe not even a proportionate response, but a sign that showed that Israel very much crossed a red line in their attack.
I agree with you, and I think it was also a way for the Iranians to say that the game has changed. They are no longer willing to accept aggressive Israeli military action against their proxies. For years, the Iranians had this approach of, you can attack our proxies will attack you, and we're going to kind of stay out of it because we don't want to get in trouble.
This wasn't even an attack against the proxy. This was a direct attack against an IRCJ general on Iranian sovereign territory.
Right, exactly. So that was like the gray area question there when the Israelis attacked the Iranian consulate in Syria. Technically, it is Iranian territory, even though it's beyond Iran's sovereign borders. And
yeah, but consulates are sovereign territory by international recognition.
Of course, and I think that kind of gray area attack from the Israeli perspective forced the Iranians to recalculate their own position, and for years, like I was saying, the Iranians looked at the Israelis as a country that's going to be in an ongoing and non-stop conflict against their proxies, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in the north or Hamas in the south. And the Iranians largely are going to stay out of it, or they'll carry out attacks that stay under under public radar and not in public view. And
what Soleimani called the ring of fire around Israel, using all these proxies to basically create this offensive barrier around Israel.
Exactly. And now this Iranian attack completely changes the goals of the game, the rules of the game. Let's say, for example, that in 3 months from now, Iran decides to shoot 10 ballistic missiles at a non-strategic site in Israel. Will Israel respond to this by going to war against Iran? Probably not. I think the Israeli public and the Israeli political leadership will look at this just like the way Iran's proxies attack one of Israel's strategic sites in the country, or non-strategic sites in the country, and will respond with some sort of tit-for-tat response. And I think that now that the Iranians have internalized this and realized this, they realize they have a lot more maneuverability in this, what was once a Cold War and has now turned into a very open hot war between them and the Israelis.
But you don't think the Iranians want like a full-scale war against the Israelis at this point?
I think the Iranians have several goals. First, beyond anything else, the most important war to them is the domestic war that they are fighting with their own people. They have to show to their own supporters domestically that there is a reason why the Iranian regime exists, and this is what their goals as a regime are truly holy goals that they are trying to bring about and really strengthen that base of support while pushing away its opponents and really positioning itself as the one and only alternative for Iranian leadership in the country. I think that's their first goal. And the second goal is really pushing their shoulders in as a regional player here. The Iranians are already a very influential power in the Middle East. They're perhaps one of the most powerful countries in the Middle East. And attacks like this really do send a clear signal to all of the allies of Iran and enemies of Iran in the Middle East that they are a power to be reckoned with.
Interesting. Do you think that the Iranians were embarrassed or upset with the result of the attack, which ultimately was thwarted in the air by the CENTCOM and the Combined Aero Defensive System?
I think that the Iranians got exactly what they wanted. I don't think that, just like we in Israel don't fully understand the extent of damage that was carried out by this alleged Israeli strike in Iran, I don't think that the Iranians and the Iranian public fully understands the extent of damage that was carried out in Israel. I think that most Iranians look at what happened, especially those who already support the regime, as this is our country going to war against the evil Zionists and we're going to support them in everything they do. I don't think that the lack of damage weakens the gain from their perspective. I think that both sides kind of came out of this mini conflict as winners. Yeah, the Israelis came out as winners for having strong defense, and the Iranians came out as winners for having a very, very aggressive offense. And that allows conflicts to end quickly because both sides are satisfied, but it leaves a lot of room for miscalculation because now we have two overly confident regional powers that may very well go into another round of fighting at some point.
I was going to say, I think if the attack was left exactly where you said it was, where, okay, the Iranians attacked, the Israelis defended, game over, everybody's happy, everybody came out a winner, you'd be absolutely right. But we have to, go back 2 nights ago. Go back a couple of nights ago to the attack on Isfahan, where 3 Israeli drones were shot out of the sky. It's still a little unclear exactly what happened, I think. I haven't been able to read like a real report. Some Iranian reports are still saying that nothing happened. Some are saying that yes, something did happen. The Israelis are being very coy about it. At the end of the day, though, it seems like it was not a major strategic hit in any way. It was close to the Isfahan nuclear site. It was close to the other nuclear site in Nantes, I believe it's called. But it wasn't close enough to either one to do any significant damage to Iran's nuclear program whatsoever. To me, the attack was a bit of an embarrassment on the Israelis' part because it had no real strategic aim. Israel had, at the moment after the Iranian attack, overwhelming international support on its side for probably the first time since the days after October 7th. And I believe that this attack is in danger of just squandering all of that. Israel really... And this is a real axe I have to grind with the Israelis, so to speak, is that I really feel like the Israelis do not understand or appreciate the extent of support they get from the West and how essential and critical that is for them to continue their military operations.
Well, when you say that the Israelis don't fully appreciate the support they get from the West, are you referring mainly to the Israeli political leadership, to the Israeli public? Who...
Well, it's symbiotic in a way. Look, there are plenty of Israelis who understand that without the United States, the IDF would be at a complete standstill. But when you look at the current administration, of Bibi Netanyahu, he understands that his supporters very much enjoy every time he sticks it to the United States. The Israelis like to think of themselves as being able to out-negotiate and outmaneuver the big, bad United States, even though we're this small, kind of energetic country. And what we saw especially, Bibi was never more popular than he was in 2015, in the middle of the Iranian nuclear agreement with the Obama administration, where he went to Congress, and in Congress, lambasted the sitting president of the United States. His polls skyrocket. His supporters ate that up. They loved it. And currently there's talk of a repeat of that kind of thing, with, in my opinion, probably the most pro-Israel president in American history. We have Joe Biden, who has been full throttle on the side of the Israelis, more so even than Ronald Reagan was back in the 1980s, where he demanded Israel stop the first Lebanon war. Joe Biden, on the other hand, he has been consistent in his deliverance of U.S. military equipment to the Israelis. Yeah, some of it has certainly gone down. Some of the major, 2,000-pound bombs have definitely decreased. But overall, the Israelis want, the Israelis get in terms of military gear. And you have, on the other hand, and we've seen this in the past weeks, just every time Netanyahu gets an opportunity, he just wants to poke Joe Biden in the eye. And he wants to try and show somehow that Israel is somehow still in charge in these negotiations.
You mentioned earlier, tying in what you're saying now to the Iranian question, you mentioned earlier that the Israeli response with this alleged strike on Isfahan is somewhat squanders the large international support that it got.
Yes, thank you for reeling me back in, because I was definitely going on a rant there about the my frustration with the current sitting administration. But yes, after the attack happened against Israel by Iran, the United States very much was in support of the Israelis, and there was even discussion of, okay, let's talk Rafiq. Let's talk how that invasion is going to look. Let's get that started. The United States very much, it seemed like, was trying to keep Israel's eye on the ball, which is Gaza, which is Hamas. Instead, and the main thing they want to avoid, the United States at least wants to avoid, is a regional war. Because a regional war with Iran could have absolutely devastating consequences that could immediately drag the Gulf states into it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's an election year, and if there's anything that can ruin an election, it's high gas prices. Just putting that out there as well. Also, that most Americans are opposed to any American military intervention in the Middle East. Biden's already suffering a little bit at the polls, so naturally he asked the Israelis, don't do anything. And once again, the Israelis decide to do an attack. It was extremely limited in scale, but to the point where I'm asking myself, why? Like, if it's so limited, why even do it in the first place?
Well, you bring up an interesting question, and it kind of ties into a news report that I read in recent days where we don't really know how accurate these reports are, but there was one report that came out stating that the Israelis and Americans cut something of a deal behind the scenes, that the Israelis will respond in a very limited fashion to the Iranian attack, and in exchange, they'll get something of a green light for the invasion of Rafah. It's not entirely clear if that deal is true and whether or not this news report is accurate, but this is something that's been murmuring about ever since the Iranian strike. I think that we spoke about in last week's episode the question of ego in war, and I think that Israel had to respond, didn't have a choice. It had to do something, I think, for its own domestic public and for its own domestic pride to stick it to the Iranians. I think that the incredibly limited nature of the Israeli response, when we both know that the Israelis are capable of causing devastating damage to the Iranians if it wanted to, the incredibly limited response of the Israelis here, I think, either was out of a desire to signal to the West, like, okay, we're not going to go too far, we're not going to spark a regional war, and there might even have been a deal that was cut here behind the scenes to promote Israeli interests from other angles, whether it's in Gaza or Lebanon. It's not entirely clear, but that's definitely something that's in the cards.
Well, look, you're absolutely right in the sense that Israel could have done a much larger strike and could have really devastated Iran, but not without impunity. At the end of the day, you have Hezbollah sitting right on Israel's border with 150,000 long-range rockets, in addition to the rest of the Iranian arsenal, which includes supersonic ballistic missiles as well, which there is, at this point, no defense against. So while, yes, the Israelis could have, absolutely devastated let's say, it wasn't like an attack on downtown Tehran or something like that, which would have really devastated some major population centers. If Israel had chosen what would have been, in my opinion, an incredibly foolish move, they would have eaten a lot of crud in response.
Yeah, and I think in the end, very few countries came out, especially Israel's allies, came out against Israel after the strike. I think that we see much of the world is kind of wanting this strike to be the last in a series of blows between Israel
Iranians
and Iran.
too, apparently. They came out saying that they would not retaliate.
Right.
Which also is embarrassing to the Israelis because, in my opinion, it makes the Iranians look like the adults at the table.
It definitely does, and that does beg the question, what did the Israelis gain here? Because what we are seeing now in recent days is definitely a significant improvement in Israel's global standing after the attack. Not only did Israel achieve the massive support of CENTCOM in this operation, which America's Central Command, that with a network of allies in the Middle East, allowed for the interception of the vast majority of missiles and pieces of ammunition that were heading into Israeli skies on the night of the attack. Beyond that immediate military support, we're seeing greater international support for Israel in recent days. And there is a question here, did Israel kind of cut a deal behind the scenes saying, we'll be cool, we won't start a major strike that will destroy the global economy and send gas prices through the roof, but we need you guys to be with us on Gaza? That's the question.
I think I 100%. I think that sort of tit for tat between the United States and Israel was very public, actually. Whether or not an actual deal occurred, like a handshake, wink, wink agreement, yeah, it's a little bit of a question mark. But in terms of just what they were both publicly posturing, the United States was very open. Like, we will assist you on a Rafah invasion if that's what it takes to end this war, but do not respond to this Iranian attack.
And this really brings us up to the second part of our podcast, where if at first we spoke about what do the Iranians want and what do they want to achieve in this conflict with Israel, we are now looking at the Israelis and their actions in recent days. And I want to tie it specifically into what we're seeing in Gaza, where you mentioned earlier that we're receiving images of people in the area of Deir el-Balach in the Gaza Strip going to the beach and going out and sunbathing. And one looks at these images of Gaza and it doesn't seem like a war's really going on in the Gaza Strip anymore. And the question has to be asked, Israel, who has largely removed its military presence from the Gaza Strip outside of one brigade that is holding a logistical corridor, has largely ended its major ground maneuver in the Gaza Strip. What is the Israeli game here?
Look, one quick aside before we jump into what the Israeli game is here. Just because I want to try and dissuade anybody who thinks that because the Gazans were at Deir el-Balach and were at the beach, that life in Gaza Strip is just back to normal. By all accounts, by all reports, life in the Strip is completely intolerable. Most people still do not have a home. They're still living in refugee tents, receiving rations from various aid groups, those who can get in there. It's not like they're just frolicking around and having an amazing time there. I think very much like how we spoke about with Israelis and our sense of resilience, the Palestinians also take pride in their resilience as well. And part of that is, even though they're in the middle of a war zone, even though they're living in absolute misery, Wednesday is a hot day, let's go to the beach. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind before we just go ahead and assume that the war in Gaza has not severely damaged the vast majority of the Palestinian population there.
There's no doubt that significant damage has been caused to the Gaza Strip, but we definitely are seeing in recent days, and I think that the images coming out of Deir el-Balach is just a microcosm of this. We're seeing in recent days things coming out of Gaza that we haven't seen since the war began. We're seeing mass movements of the Palestinian population from some parts of the Gaza Strip northwards, much of which was largely impossible during the major Israeli ground maneuvers in Khan Yunis and in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. We're seeing these images coming out of Deir el-Balach. I'm not trying to say that the Gaza Strip has turned into.
I'm not accusing you. I've seen a lot of stuff
Clearly,
online about it. I'm like, people need to calm down a little bit.
Clearly, the Gaza Strip is light years away from turning into Abu Dhabi or Dubai,
or just pre-October 7th Gaza,
or just pre-October 7th Gaza. But the facts are facts that clearly something is going on here. Where
no, you're right in the sense that
there's something different here than what was.
You're absolutely right. That is a microcosm in the sense that the Israeli military has stopped major operations inside of Gaza. That for sure is true. There is a lot more freedom of movement at the very least for Gazans. We know that aid has increased dramatically into Gaza due largely to international pressure. The IDF moved out of Khan Yunis again due to international pressure. Look, I want to answer your question about what is the Israeli endgame here, but I also do want to make the point of this is how badly Israel has screwed up international support, and this is why it's so essential, and something that I feel like Israelis really miss. The reason why that Hamas responded the way it did to our most recent negotiations is because they feel like they have all the time in the world. The Israelis are pulling out militarily. If you truly believe that military pressure is going to be what it takes to get the hostages released, and there are some people who say that doesn't matter. I to be honest, I'm kind of also in that camp a little bit, that no amount of military pressure is going to create the conditions for Hamas fully releasing the hostages. But if you're saying that that military pressure is going to be what it takes to convince Hamas to releasing the hostages, then Israel has essentially failed at this point, because there is essentially no military pressure being pressed against Hamas at this point.
Right.
Now, as opposed to, the question of what the Israeli end goal is, at this point, as Bibi says, we're just we're so close to total victory, which I think at this point we can all acknowledge is an absolute just lie. The idea that total victory, I think, as Netanyahu presented it, of Hamas being completely destroyed and eradicated and all the hostages coming home, I just don't see that happening.
Yeah. Well, I think that the best we could achieve in Gaza, and it's not clear whether we will achieve this, but I think that the best case scenario in Gaza is to achieve there what Israel achieved in the West Bank, which is basically military control of the Gaza Strip to significantly reduce the threat of terror from the Gaza Strip, but probably not completely eliminate the threat of terror. That's a overly ambitious goal that Israel probably will not achieve. It can, after many, many years of fighting, bring terror down to a bare minimum, but this takes years. You even look at, for example, Israel's operation in the West Bank in 2002 to bring an end to the Second Intifada, where Israel re-entered major Palestinian cities for the first time since the Oslo Accords to fight off against terror organizations in the West Bank. And many military analysts credit this Operation Defensive Shield, with bringing about an end to the Second Intifada. But the operation started in 2002, and we largely only saw the benefits of this operation in 2006, 2007. It took years and years and years of Israel going in and out of Palestinian cities. This is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. And even today, we're seeing that there's still Palestinian terror hotspots in the West Bank. There's no cure-all here, but I think Israel can, if it focuses on that goal of bringing Gaza to the point of what it already has achieved in the West Bank, it can achieve that goal. But the only way it can do that is with massive and ongoing military operations throughout the Gaza Strip, whether it's pinpointed raids, whether it's massive brigade or division level maneuvers into terror hotbeds. I think that the next step for Israel in order to really close this gap is to go ahead and invade the remaining parts of the Gaza Strip that have so far been untouched from this war. And we're seeing that the two main hotspots of terror in the Gaza Strip that have been untouched in this war is Rafiah, of course, and Deir el-Balah, two areas that have largely not seen a significant ground maneuver. And before Israel can completely shift to only pinpointed raids in the Gaza Strip and putting an end to massive brigade-based and division-based maneuvers, it's going to have to give an answer to these Hamas battalions that have largely been unscathed during this war.
I have a question about the intelligence of these Hamas brigades and what we know about them. Because what we've seen from reports on the ground is that every time Israel leaves an area, Hamas immediately comes back. Considering that most Hamas fighters are underground, are living underground, how do we know that a brigade has been broken up? At what point does the Israeli army, and I feel you'd be able to answer this question because you worked in army intelligence for a while, how do we know that a brigade is broken to the point where what do we even consider to have been broken up?
Excellent question. First of all, we should say with a degree of modesty that all of what we know is based off of estimates. It's very, very logical guesses from intelligence that one can gather on the ground. There's no objective and 100% effective way of knowing whether or not a brigade has been destroyed or whether a Hamas brigade has been brought to the point of zero effectiveness. It's guess and check. That's all it really is. It's making certain assumptions based on things that we're seeing on the ground, and guessing based off of that, and making estimates as to whether or not we are in that place where we can say, okay, battalion number 5 in this area has been brought to the point of complete an operation. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. Individual soldiers report on the ground how many terrorists they kill, and obviously these numbers get reported back up to HQ, and they're able to kind of count and see, in total how many terrorists have largely been killed. You have, of course, other intelligence indications as to the activity of Hamas in different areas, and when you see that activity goes down, you can make an assumption that Hamas's battalions are no longer functioning to the same degree. But again, these are all estimates. A lot of these, especially when it comes to reports coming from the battlefield, a lot of these reports are very inaccurate. You can have a soldier shooting at a building, and a tank shooting at a building, for example, claiming that he killed 10 terrorists, and there might be 50 terrorists inside, or there might be 2 terrorists inside, and you have absolutely no idea, but he'll report 10. And at the end of the day, it is just estimates. And we can see that largely the areas that Israel has said that Hamas is no longer functioning as a fully fledged military entity, it is largely the case, and Israel does have somewhat of a grasp on the numbers in an accurate way. But it does make mistakes. We saw the mistake in Shifa, for example, where Israel basically launched what was ultimately a very successful operation against Shifa Hospital in the northern part of the Gaza Strip that Israelis were very happy about, but that was indicative of something of an intelligence gap there, where Israelis basically underestimated Hamas's power in that part of the Gaza Strip.
Look, I will say too, I mean, the idea of basing a military strategy on how many enemies you've killed is a problem that plagued, counterinsurgent groups for decades. I mean, in the Vietnam War, that was exactly how the American soldiers tried to justify missions, and we saw how that whole war ended up.
Yeah.
One more point real quick. I do want to say, too, the other thing about reporting battlefield, any kind of battlefield action, is that because the adrenaline is so high, because it's so intense, just from a personal anecdote, I remember when we were in the northern Gaza Strip, and we were talking about, we were doing a post-action report, and there was a tank that had said that it had seen a mine, and no one else saw it. And I swear, to this day, I watched the tank go in reverse, and an anti-personnel mine exploded, which didn't damage the tank at all, because it's meant for people. But it exploded, and I told everybody, and nobody saw it. And I swear to this day, I know those things look like when they explode. That's exactly what I saw. So it's crazy how, for instance, you can have two soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, and they'll both see separate things.
They'll both see completely different things, and you'll even see that at the level of brigade or battalion, that different brigades and battalions report in different ways. I've even in my own personal experience seen, served alongside battalions that will do excellent work in the field and will go out and kill a very significant number of terrorists, and they won't say anything. They won't report back because they didn't think it was important to share that information with the people above them. And then you see battalions who do somewhat mid-level work in terms of their activity and aren't as successful, and they'll over-report the amount of people that they killed or the amount of terrorists that they killed. So obviously, reporting here in war, especially when it comes to understanding, where Hamas is in terms of its level of operation, is very difficult. And then you have this other question of what do you determine, there's a word in Hebrew for this called achra'ah and ashmada, meaning like at what point do you bring Hamas to the point of akhra'ah, to the point where it is no longer a functioning military entity and they've kind of been defeated, and at what point you bring them to hashmada, where they've been destroyed. And akhra'ah, the first one, is really something of an artistic question. Yeah, like at what point do you defeat Hamas? You can come up with all sorts of numbers, and you can say, for example, once you've destroyed 60% of the personnel in Hamas, they are no longer functioning as a military entity, and they have been defeated but not destroyed because they still have the remaining 40%. You can come up with all sorts of numbers like that and back it up with all sorts of research as to how Hamas functions and how much of its people does it need to really function as a military entity. And these things might all be fine and great, but it's all estimates by individuals who are making guesses largely as to how Hamas works.
It makes me really miss the 18th style century European conflict, where the opposing defeated commander would just present his colors to the successful commander, and everybody knew the war was over right then. All right, but let's bring it back real quick, though, to Rafiach and Dir al-Balach, because the question is, do you think that invading those areas is really going to be the akhra'ah ashmada of Hamas? Because at this point, I mean, it seems like Hamas is more than content to just go underground, bide their time. Yes, of course, they're going to do hit-and-run attacks. They need that for their propaganda. They need that also to just maintain morale amongst their own soldiers. But at the end of the day, are those invasions really going to spell the end of Hamas?
Look, I don't think the end of Hamas is really in the cards here. I think that the best we can hope for, like I said earlier, is bringing Hamas to the point of like what we have in the West Bank, where it's kind of this very disparate guerrilla organization that we can attack with pinpointed raids. I think that's the best case scenario. Now, if we go into a division level invasion of Rafiach, will Hamas just go underground to avoid the invasion? Probably. But that's what we're trying to do. Yeah, what we're trying to do is first, before we could kill every single terrorist, we're trying to bring Hamas to the point where they're acting like a disparate guerrilla force. Yeah, once you do that, you achieve your first initial goal of you're not killing all the Hamas members, but you're changing their mode of operation. They're no longer a functioning military entity that takes responsibility for a part of the Gaza Strip. They're a guerrilla force that by nature has to hide in order to come out and fight. So I think that's like the first goal of this planned division-based invasion of Rafiah. And then once you do that, you can pull out of Rafiah the way that Israel already pulled out of Khan Yunis and the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and you can replace its operation with very pinpointed raids on specific disparate guerrilla forces in Rafiah. I think that if Israel does what the Americans are suggesting, and in this case I disagree with the American approach, where the Americans are suggesting just start out from the very beginning in Rafiah with pinpointed operations against the Hamas leadership, I don't think that's going to work. I think that sending soldiers into an area where there's 4 active Hamas battalions that are completely in control of the field, I think that is incredibly dangerous to the soldiers that are going to go on missions like that. And I think it's going to take a lot more time in order for Israel to even get close to any sort of any sort of defeat of Hamas in
Look, I agree with you, man. I think that it's well, what you said in the sense that at least it's going to be incredibly dangerous to all the soldiers, like the special ops units who will be carrying out these missions. You're absolutely correct. This was at the early days of the post-October 7th war. The Americans suggested the exact same thing. They suggested sending special units down into tunnels and carrying out the war in that way. And, that would have been me and my unit, and we were terrified at the prospect of doing something like that. At the time, the IDF's policy was nobody goes into the tunnels because they were convinced that they were booby-trapped and this and that, and they ended up going with a full-scale full-scale aerial assault accompanied by artillery, and then a ground invasion. And what we ended up seeing, what the Americans warned us about, was the complete loss in international support. Now, on the flip side, everybody predicted there being 10 times more casualties on the Israeli side than there actually was. However, I think a lot of critics would say, well, that came at the expense of the Palestinian civilians who died in place of the Israeli soldiers. Look, as this is a moral question then that we get is the Israeli government more beholden to their own soldiers as opposed to Palestinian civilians? Look, I can Monday morning quarterback this all day and say that there's a strategic necessity to ensure that the Palestinian civilians are not harmed. But when I was getting drafted back on October 8th, I was all for bomb the shit out of him if it means that I'm coming home to me and my family. Like it's one thing to sit on the couch as the Americans are doing, or not sit on the couch, of course, but you know what I mean. Sit back and say one thing. It's completely another thing when you're the people sending your guys in there. And to that, I can't say one way or another what's better, because on the one hand, I do want strategic victory. And strategic victory is going to mean, in my opinion, more targeted assaults and targeted raids. On the other hand, it is more than likely going to mean more Israeli soldiers are going to die than what we've seen up until this point.
Yes, as long as Israel carries out these pinpointed attacks without a major aerial and ground assault to kind of soften the ground. Yeah, I think that if Israel carries out these pinpointed raids in the North Gaza Strip and Khan Yunis, I don't think that we should reasonably expect a significant number of Israeli casualties, because I think it's going to look quite.
No, I'm speaking about Rafiah and
Rafiah. Yeah, then if you're speaking about Rafiah, I think that you're definitely right. That's definitely what would inevitably happen, which is why I think Israel, going back to what do the Israelis want and tying it into our earlier conversation about Iran, I would not be surprised if the Israelis cut a deal to basically get something of a green light, or at the very least a yellow light, to go into Rafiah in exchange for a softer response on Iran, because I think the Israelis realize that only with a major, at least division level attack on Rafiah can it bring about the end to this stage of the war. The war is not going to end anytime soon, but it at least can bring about an end to this stage of the war. But there is an even deeper question here, which is whether or not our conversation that we're having right now is at all connected to what's going on in Israel's political leadership. Yeah, because what we're seeing is, much of the country is gossiping and talking about this upcoming invasion of Rafiah and how it's important and why it's important and what it can do for Israel from a strategic perspective. But, we're seeing on the ground that Israel has one brigade left in Gaza who's holding a logistical corridor, and the question...
And people are dying every day holding that corridor. It cannot be forgotten.
Yeah, people are putting themselves in in harm's way, holding that corridor. Um, and the question is asked here: what exactly is the Israeli plan for Gaza? What is the long term game here? Is Israel really getting ready for this next step in Rafah, or is it kind of getting the Israeli public used to this change on the ground where it's slowly but surely bringing a war to the end?
Well, this is kind of what I wanted to mention when you spoke about the 2002 operation in the West Bank, Operation Defensive Shield. Is that, I think fighting 2002 in the West Bank is extremely different than fighting in Gaza in 2024. Gaza is essentially an underground fortress. It's, in terms of urban density, much greater than anything that really exists in the West Bank on the scale that we're seeing. And it is very well guarded and well defended by a united insurgent group, I would say. So this idea that we can continue to do pinpoint raids and eventually overthrow Hamas, I in the most optimistic assumptions, I would say maybe. But quite frankly, it doesn't even matter at the end of the day, because even if Hamas is destroyed and somehow we manage to bring back the hostages in the process, there will just be another underground organization. The best Israel can... And to be clear, there will always be, in my opinion, some kind of terror element within Palestinian society. There's always going to be that group of violent Palestinians who want nothing less than the total destruction of Israel and just everything to be Palestine. So I'm not saying that group is ever going to go away, but you can severely limit its ability to recruit and to operate by, at the very least, I would say, ensuring some kind of political solution to this, because no insurgency is won without a political solution, and that's just the long and the short of it.
I agree with you 100%. I think that Israel can even pilot certain areas of the Gaza Strip for a political solution. It can pilot the northern Gaza Strip, which is, compared to other parts of the Gaza Strip, the easiest areas for a new regime to take over and to replace Hamas, whether it's an international Arab peacekeeping force, whether it's the Palestinian Authority that's revitalized, as the Biden administration likes to say. This was a topic that we also went into in our previous episode, the future of Gaza. But the facts the facts on the ground that we're witnessing is an Israeli leadership that's not interested in a political solution and seems to be not interested in a full-on military solution, considering how many troops have just been pulled out of the Gaza Strip. So there is this question here as to what exactly do the Israelis want, and as much as I wanna hope that the Israeli political leadership is crafting this long-term vision for Gaza, where this is just the initial troop pullout is just part of this grander next move that Israel's going to do in Rafah and Dillon and Michael and other parts of the Gaza Strip. I do have this eerie feeling of, are they trying to get us used to this new normal where, we hit Gaza and Gaza hit us back, and we're just going to kind of let this fight sizzle out?
I mean, you take that one step further, there's plenty on the Israeli left who believe that Netanyahu and his coalition just want an endless war, because that's the one thing that's going to maintain their power, is that, the politicians can consistently shout, we need unity, we need togetherness, biyachad ninatzeach, as long as the war is continuing. The minute the war ends, I think the entire country is going to be ready for new elections and just seeing like, okay, if we want Bibi, let's vote, let's decide. And there is this very cynical belief that Netanyahu in particular is using the war as just a way to hold on to power. I mean, that's what we've heard from the families of the hostages, that's why that the government in the last 2 weeks made sure that their negotiations even had very little maneuverability, and they rejected any kind of proposal from Hamas, was because they just want the war to continue. And quite frankly, I mean, I hate sinking in this kind of cynicism. I really do. Like you and I like to approach these things from a very sort of clinical and logical perspective. Like, okay, what's it really going to take to succeed in these operations? But you're right, the 2 points you just laid out run counter to any kind of idea of success in Gaza. This idea of kind of a military fizzle out, of just this is just kind of how life is now. It's incredibly disappointing and depressing, and it reminds me of when I spoke to one of my buddies who was in the Golani Special Unit, and we both got released around the same time, and he called me and he's like, man, I'm so disappointed, I'm so upset that like I got released. I want to get in there, I want to be in there, I want to win. And I'm like, dude, the Israelis already lost. Like, seriously, just be glad that you're going home, that you didn't die on this hill that we're not going to be able to keep. Like, go home, go to your family, just be grateful. You did what you had to do, and you came out the other side.
Yeah.
And it's depressing to think that way. It's depressing to think that everything that everybody sacrificed, particularly those who sacrificed their lives, they did it for nothing.
Yeah. For no long strategic game.
For this sort of like knee-jerk revenge reaction, and then that was it. And to keep some old men in power for a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And it's horrible.
Well, that really does bring us to the next part of this question here, which is we spoke about what Iran wants, we spoke about what Israel wants. What do you think Sinvar and Gaza wants?
Sinvar, I think at this point he's really chomping at the bit. He wants that regional flare-up. I think for him, Iran and the potential of an Israeli counterattack, if anything, what Sinwar wants, he wants an exaggerated Israeli counterattack against Iran. He wants the regional conflagration. He wants the Houthis to start launching missiles at southern Israel while Hezbollah launches at northern and central Israel. He wants the activation of Soleimani's Ring of Fire. He's ready for that to happen. In terms of the hostages, quite frankly, and I hate to say this, I think he believes he only really needs a couple of them. A couple hostages in order to get all the Palestinian prisoners freed. I as terrible as it is, I think that's by the calculations of the Hamas leadership. I mean, don't forget Sinvar was released in the Gilad Shalit deal. That was one IDF soldier in exchange for 1,000 Palestinians. So by math, all he really needs is about half a dozen Israeli hostages. He can get everybody out. But more than that, and Hamas has been very open about this. They want more and more October 7th style attacks, and I think Hamas understands that they cannot militarily overwhelm Israel, but what they can do is be the spark that ignites the entire region. And in going back, I mean, when we look at Iran, and what does Iran represent on a larger Middle Eastern scale? Iran represents an alternative to the Western-dominated world order. Iran is a fundamentalist Islamic regime that has overthrown Western hegemony in form of the Shah in Iran and replaced it in a way that communism kind of did during the Cold War. And I think Sinwar really sees that as being the future of the Middle East and is a sort of unified, under the banner of Islam, region that is powerful enough and united enough and wealthy enough to actually, even in some cases, take on the West.
Take on the West.
Yeah. But what do you think? What do you think that Sinwar wants?
You might be right. I think that the individual components that you mentioned there of sparking a regional war, igniting the Ring of Fire against Israel, I think that's definitely the means that he's trying to employ. In terms of the end, where he's trying to go, I think that his end game here is survival. And survival not just for him. I think survival for him is really the survival of independent Palestinian hegemony in the Gaza Strip, and perhaps expanding that to other parts of what he considers Palestine, the West Bank, and parts of modern day Israel. And I think that he's in no rush. He has
definitely
no incentive to go into a major deal right now with Israel over the hostages. He is going to push the Israelis, or more accurate to say, he's going to keep the Israelis on a low flame for as long as he possibly can. He knows that he has a lot more time here than the Israelis do, and every day that goes by where the Israelis have not achieved complete victory, which is what Prime Minister Netanyahu has promised the Israeli public, every day that Israelis have not achieved complete victory is one more day that Sinval was closer to victory for Hamas. And at a certain point, if he plays his cards right, and Sinval knows to keep pushing the Israelis down the line and kick the bucket down the line, he knows at a certain point the Israelis will have no choice but to pull out of the Gaza Strip completely. The international pressure will be too strong, and the expected Israeli gain from staying in the Gaza Strip will be too low. And Sinval can both keep the hostages for maybe a later deal and also stay the leader of the Gaza Strip, and perhaps from there the leader of additional parts of the Middle East. I think that he is really playing this game of patience here against the Israelis, and it's for that reason that I don't see any hostage deal coming out in the foreseeable future.
Well, that's kind of the belief, is that neither Sinwar nor Netanyahu have any real political interest in seeing this war come to an end. And I remember I heard it said that really at the end of the day, this war is just a battle between two men, Sinwar and Netanyahu. And it's safe to say that you're right, that if any kind of successful military operation is going to take years, and at the end of the day, neither side has an incentive to come to any kind of peace agreement. And speaking of peace agreements, I think let's tie it back to the one question nobody's asking. What do the Americans want out of all this?
Oh, good question.
I don't know, nobody seems to care about the Americans, but what do the Americans want?
Yeah, we went through multiple American administrations here, which want to get more involved in the Middle East, want to disengage from the Middle East.
Yeah.
If you look at the Middle East on a multi-decade scale here, you see that the Americans are probably more fickle than any other.
Yeah, I mean, just during our lifetime, you start with the Clinton years, and you end up, Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden. Like, what?
Right.
It's a feeling of whiplash just within our lifetimes.
Yeah, so I guess, if we're talking about a battle between two men, well, I guess we'll add the third man here, President Biden. And, what does Biden want? Yeah, because I think Biden wants something that might not be identical to what a future administration might want in America. Who knows who will lead the White House in the coming years. And
Just real quick, who do you think's going to lead it?
Oh, that's we'll save that for our next podcast.
Here we get closer.
But good question. I think in terms of the perspective that Biden has on this conflict, I think Biden looks at the conflict and the Middle East in general from two angles. The first angle is his short-term and medium-term interest, which is winning elections in the United States, and he cannot win an election in the United States if America's most stable ally is causing major public relations damage to the United States by carrying out what is, from the perspective of some in the international community, war crimes in the Gaza Strip. And I'm not going into the question as to whether or not it is or isn't war crimes. It doesn't really matter, because when it's a PR game, it's all a question of perspective,
right,
and not really one of factual, of fact or fiction.
Right. Time will tell what
right,
how we can label Israeli actions in Gaza.
Exactly. It's right now it's really a PR game, and I think that Biden is has this short and medium term goal of, I'm going to do whatever I can to win an election, and I think all of his policy is largely based on that. And then, of course, you have the long-term goal here, which is beyond the upcoming election cycle, of presenting America as being this great provider of security and stability and power. We really saw it in the alliance that America crafted through CENTCOM and its defense of Israel over the past week. And I think that was kind of America's way to wink to the rest of the world, be it in the Russia-Ukraine war, be it in other conflicts that we might not necessarily be willing to provide you with our defense, but just to let you know, if you do have America on your side, you have a lot to gain. And I think that's the long-term game that America's playing here, of really kind of reasserting itself as this major power. That being said, how do politicians choose? Do they choose between the short and medium-term goals, or do they choose to go based on their long-term goals? I think that Biden largely chooses to go by his short and medium-term goals, which is why that we're seeing all of his behavior towards Israel, towards the Palestinians, towards the Iranians, towards just about everybody, is really just based on what do I need to do to win an election?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, it's not just Biden that looks at short-term interests. American presidents, by nature, they have maximum 8 years, so they can only really. I mean, as we saw, Obama had 8 years. Trump came into office and basically undid everything Obama accomplished. So, as the U.S. president, you're very much incentivized to make those short-term gains, and American people will vote for you based on the short-term gains. But you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, Biden is. I think we already mentioned the gas prices, and we've already seen, post the Iranian attack, I believe that gas did increase by about 5%, and immediately did drop back down. But there was there was a lot of prospectors who were very skeptic about what was going on there. But I think one of the bigger issues in terms of winning this election actually is Michigan, and the fact that it has the largest concentration of Arab Americans. I think last I read it was about 2.2% of the population, and Biden really only won that state by about a 0.2% vote. So the Arab American population has major power. They may not vote for Trump, but just them not voting could be all it takes for Biden to essentially lose the election.
To tilt the election.
Exactly right. And so, on the one hand, look, he's older than the state of Israel, which is crazy to say, but it's true. He's older than the state. He grew up during the Cold War. He very much sees the world, I believe, as America's allies and America's enemies. And Israel has always been a staunch American ally, very firmly in the U.S.'s corner. Has never toyed with communism, has never once been in the orbit of the USSR. And so it is, historically speaking, within the Middle East, the most stable of U.S. allies. And of course, there's the close ideological connection that Israel and the United States have. They're both democracies. They both believe in the liberal human rights, at least on paper. And for now, there's just a quote. I believe it was Smotrich who came out recently saying that he just said the IDF needs to become not more lethal but more evil. So yeah, for now is definitely a correct way of saying that. And so anyway, to tie it back, I think that's exactly where Biden draws a lot of his support to Israel. As what the United States wants in the long term, honestly, I think they want to get away from the Middle East. I think Biden is very much following in the footsteps, or wanted to follow in the footsteps of Obama, and really continue to create these sort of strategic barrier that's preventing as much Chinese trade as possible. It was, shoring up alliances with the Philippines, with Japan, setting up U.S. military presence there in order to deter Chinese trade and to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. As opposed to what they want specifically with U.S. regional interests. I mean, the Abraham Accords showed us that they're ready to use Iran as a way of shoring up their strategic alliance and their influence over the Sunni states, and more importantly, trying to isolate Iran and its allies, and I think basically just keep them as economically weak as possible.
Yeah.
Do you agree with the?
Yeah, no, I think America is really looking to play this game of, keeping its enemies down and, showing and broadcasting the benefits of an alliance with the United States, and using that even beyond the Middle East. I think your connection to the Far East and to Asia is really accurate here. Yeah, I think that the Americans, when they play the superpower game here, they're not looking just at Iran Israel as a local game. They look at this greater game that they're playing against China and against other world powers, and seeing how their relevance is affected by these actions. All right, so I think that really ties up this week's episode.
Yeah, I think so. I know we wished everybody a happy Passover last week, but we managed to squeeze another episode. So if you already listened to it, and we're going to wish you a double happy Passover. I'm tomorrow getting on a plane going to California. Get a little break from the Middle East, and it'll definitely be interesting, I think, to just be in the United States and see firsthand kind of what the atmosphere is like, especially in Los Angeles, which is an incredibly diverse city. Very curious to see, or on the flip side, which would be my dream, which is to just not feel anything about what's going on in the Middle East. And just people...
Good luck with that.
Yeah, just being in a place where people are just living their lives carefree. Is that so much to ask for? But yes, that's where I'll be. What about you? You gonna be here?
I'm gonna be here. Gonna be doing Passover in Moshav Patish, in Otef Aza, in the Gaza envelope in Israel. I'm gonna be with my fiance's family who lives in the Moshav, and yeah, we'll have to report after Passover about our
very opposite
shares.
experiences
Very opposite
for
experiences.
Passover. Amazing. All right, man. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Happy Passover. I hope it's as peaceful and joyous as it can possibly be. And that hopefully we'll be able to start doing podcasts with happier news at some point.